I'd like to welcome everybody here to this series of videos that I'm doing that pertain to the skills to the 1820s to 1840 mountain man era here in the United States. One of the things that the people that lived in this country during that time period and before and after was the process of brain tanning, taking the animal's skin and turning it into usable leather, mostly garment, clothing, dresses, shirts, and things of that nature. As the term brain tanning implies, this is what was used was the animal's brain in the tanning process. Once the hide had been fleshed, once it had been dehaired, then the animal's brain was pushed through the pores of the flesh, and the chemicals, the enzymes in the brain, the oils in the brain would actually allow the hide to relax enough so that they can manipulate it to turn it into usable leather. But before I really get into that process, I want to dispel a few things that I have learned over the years regarding brain tanning. There are three things I would like to discuss just briefly. And myself, having been brain tanning for nearly 3 decades, I've actually kind of sat back, watched, listened, and observed a few things. Early on, I was querying whether one particular animal's brain was better over another. And at that time, beef brain was pretty readily available at your grocery stores. And at that time, everybody that was brain tanning would say, oh, beef brain's the best, you'll get nothing better. And then I started asking, what about pig brain? Oh no, you want to stay away from pig brain. Pig brains don't do as good a job. Well, as the mad cow's disease started to spread throughout the United States in particular, everybody brain tanning shied away from beef brain because you could no longer get them. And guess what the #1 best brain is now? You got it, pig brain. So all those years that everybody was talking bad about pig brain, everybody is now using pig brains because it's the best. So those are some of the things that as you learn to brain tan that you really have to take with a grain of salt. As far as I'm concerned, a brain is a brain, is a brain, is a brain. They all have the same chemicals, the same enzymes, and the same oils in them that you need to tan like a deer hide. The other thing that I have observed over the years, and something that I've learned, and I actually prefer to use it myself, is eggs. Chicken eggs, ostrich eggs, whatever eggs you can get a hold of. Eggs have the necessary enzymes, they have the necessary oils, and more importantly, they have albumin in them. And that's what a lot of your professional tanners today use, is this albumin. One thing that I have noticed again over the years while watching and observing is that some of these things appear to be held secretive among us brain tanners. I remember one time wearing this frock for the first time into a buckskinny camp. I came across a gentleman that was actually scraping down a couple of deer hides in camp. Now it looked really nice, looked really cool, really aesthetically pleasing for the period that we tried to portray with the brain tanning. And he was there working his hides, scraping his hides. And I went up and engaged him in a conversation. And one thing that I have noticed over the years is that some of these guys are absolutely afraid to engage another brain tanner in an absolute conversation about techniques, what works best, whether dry scraping, wet scraping works best, scraping stretched on a rack, or scraping stretched over a beam or a log. There is no great secret, but as I engaged him more and more in a conversation, he was letting me know that the only way he does his hides is with brains. And at that point, I had mentioned to him that I had actually tanned. Now, this particular jacket has 4 elk hides in it, and I had to use 4 elk hides because today's hunter is very inept at skinning an animal properly for the purpose of garment material. A lot of guys will use their knives and they'll actually cut the flesh instead of the membrane, and then when you work that hide and scrape it down, wherever the flesh is cut, you will develop a hole at that point, whether it's in the dehairing process or whether it is in the actual stretching of the hide. It will tear where the inside of the flesh is cut. So I had mentioned to him that I had actually tanned this with eggs. Well, immediately I got to, well, eggs ain't the best. I only use the brain because the brain does better, and the brain, and everything that he could say to knock down the process of using eggs was used. So I didn't let it discourage me because I know the mindset of some of these guys. But I found it interesting is during the course of that weekend, he was expecting another buckskin and to bring him some brains into camp so that he could brain tan the deer hides he was working on. Well, as things worked out, the brains were not brought in to camp, and the only other solution that this brain tanner had was to use eggs. And I found it very interesting and very hypocritical that he was going around to different campsites asking for eggs so that he could finish up his brain tanning. And I thought that was kind of ironic that, here he is bad-mouthing my process, and yet he's using the same process that I use for tanning this particular jacket. So my recommendation is that if you're going to learn how to do brain tanning, I would recommend reading as much material as you can, finding out what works, what doesn't work. There are a lot of different things in the dehairing process that once I get to that portion I will discuss, not in any great length, but just to kind of make it simple and easy for you. But again, my recommendation is to read everything you can and then do some experimenting. Try to work on 4 or 5 different hides if you can, and work with what suits you as a brain tanner the best. If you can attend some of these mountain man rendezvous where there's a brain tanner, don't be afraid to engage him in a conversation, but also keep in mind a lot of the brain tanners like to keep their processes secret, and there is no great secret to brain tanning. It's just a matter of acquiring a decent hide, dehairing it, and putting it in the brain solution or the egg solution, and then the actual tanning process is the smoking process, and I will discuss that when we get to that point. So I hope you're not afraid to tackle this. It is something that could be dirty. There are some smells involved with this that you might have to get used to, but the biggest thing is in the end you'll be proud to wear something that you have actually brain tanned yourself, hopefully had an opportunity to harvest yourself. But the biggest thing is that don't let any one brain tanner tell you what is the absolute best process, because the things that I have learned the past 3 decades is that you'll want to work with what works best for you, and that's all that really matters in the end. And don't be afraid to leave a few comments in the comment section down below. And the only stupid question or the dumb question is the question that's never asked, and that's the only way we can ever learn to be proficient brain tanners, and hopefully that'll be it. Okay, before I actually get into the fleshing process, I want to discuss a little bit about a fleshing beam. Traditionally, a log or something like that was used as a fleshing beam. I like using a nice solid piece of PVC. This is a 6-inch piece of PVC. The reason I like this as opposed to a log is that when you use a log, sometimes you can gouge a log, and when you start fleshing, you can hit that gouge and it can cause you to put a hole in your hide. Whereas something smooth like this piece of PVC can help prevent that. Now, I have to admit, these can get gouged. With the method I use, I actually wet scrape and I use a sharp knife. There's some pros and cons as opposed to using a sharp knife in lieu of a dull knife or something like that. I can control a sharp knife just as well as I can control a dull knife. I like using a sharp knife just simply because part of the process in dehairing is you have to scrape the epidermal layer off of the hide. And for myself, a sharp knife does that a little bit quicker than a dull knife does. But I've just built a little stand that supports the PVC tube, and for me it works really well. Again, this is a knife that I've made to use for scraping. Sometimes I'll use a thin blade knife like an old hickory that has some flex to it, but more often than not I actually forged the scraping tool from a tie rod end off of a Toyota car. It just allows me just good control over the knife when I'm actually scraping. Now, when you are scraping, I do recommend you getting a good pair of rubber gloves, just simply because there are some bacteria involved on the hide in the soaking process. A lot of guys that brain tan will get a 55-gallon drum, fill it full of water, submerge the hide, put in 3 or 4 shovel scoops of ash. The ash produces a lye, which actually speeds up the bacteria process that takes place, that actually eats a little bit of that flesh enough so that the hair will slip. But you still have to scrape everything down. I myself, I just use the 55-gallon drum with water. I don't use any chemicals in it. I just let the hide soak for 5 to 6 days. This particular hide that I'm going to demonstrate, I've had soaking for 6 days already, and you will see that that's adequate enough to scrape, slip the hair. One of the advantages that I like to just soaking it in water is that, admittedly, yeah, the bacteria grows, but as soon as you're done the fleshing process of it, you don't have to neutralize any of the chemical reaction like with a lye. It's been my experience that when you use wood ash, the lye, you have to go back afterwards, do another soaking to neutralize it, and some of the guys that do brain tanning will neutralize it with vinegar. With the way I do it, once the sun dries it, it kills that bacteria that's actually allowing the hair to slip. So I'm going to get things prepared here, and I'll meet you back in just a few moments. Okay, this was a deer that I actually harvested this year, and I'm going to start the scraping process. And as you can see, with just a little bit of pressure, the hair is slipping. So the time for scraping is optimal. What you want to do is you want to be able to scrape hard enough that you can remove the hair and get through the epidermal layer. Getting through the epidermal layer is critical to the brain tanning process, excuse me, because what you want to do is you want to be able to get your solution, whether it be brains or whether it be eggs, to get through the pores of the hide. This is important because if your tanning solution or your brain solution or your egg solution does not get through the pores, then your hide will dry with hard spots. So this does take a little bit of work, a little bit of effort. You can tell when you're getting through the epidermal layer, because you will actually see the pores of the hide open up. And you can probably hear the scraping that I'm doing, and you can always look at the bottom of your knife or your scraping tool to see the epidermal layer coming off with the hair. And that's why I prefer to use a sharp knife, because I can get through that layer of skin the same time I'm pushing the hair off. Now I like to work in the opposite direction of the hair, because what I learned early on, if you go with the hair, sometimes it's too easy to slip, but if you go against the hair, you can actually see what you're working as you're scraping the epidermal layer off. You don't have to take big long strokes. Just good short strokes will do, as long as you can see you're getting through the epidermal layer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scrape some hair off, and hopefully the camera will show that underneath the hair there's this grayish colored layer of flesh. That's your epidermal layer. That's what needs to come off this hide. And I'm going to go back and scrape it again, and you can see that that layer is being scraped off the hide. And you can see that that's being left behind on the knife. And that's the purpose of the scraping process. There again, I like doing a wet scrape because there's a lot more give in the hide. Myself, I can control what I do better. What I have learned over the years, when you dry scrape on a stretching rack, sometimes it's relatively easy to puncture a hole into the hide, especially the thinner you get in the scraping process. This way here, the hide stays nice and thick, and there's a lot of give to the hide. Now when I'm working a hide, I like to kind of like work in a little bit of a circle, scrape a little bit, reposition the hide, and go to scraping. And here again you can see I'm not taking long strokes. I'm just using nice controlled short strokes. Sometimes in the scraping process you'll leave scraping marks behind in the hide. Myself, that don't bother me. I know some of the brain tanners like absolutely smooth looking hides, and when I'm after a hide that has to be absolutely smoothed, what I do is after I soften it, then I'll go back over it with a pumice stone, a very coarse pumice stone, and that'll get a lot of the scrape marks out of the hide, because what you're actually doing is you're actually thinning the hide at that point to where you're sanding basically off those scraping marks. So I don't worry about that at this point. For the products that I make out of brain tan, for myself and the customers that I sell to, they like that more rustic look in the hides that I produce. So there again, that is a matter of personal preference. So I'm going to get back to work, and I'll join you as I progress. Okay, as you're working these hides, you have to be mindful that there's going to be some spots on the hide that are going to be a little tough to scrape through. One of the areas that sometimes can be kind of tough is the back end where the hide is really thick. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer for the bacteria to eat through, the epidermal layer to make it, to make the hair slip. Just work it slow, be patient. You don't have to get any big hurry. The other area that you have to be really cautious about is the belly portion of the game. You can see that it's pretty thin as compared to where the main portion of the body is. What I recommend is when you get to this portion, just work it slow, because this is where you can very easily cut through the flesh, keeping in mind that it is very, very thin. So work slow, work light, and with the right technique and the right pressure, you can see that epidermal layer will be able to scrape right off. Another tough area on these hides is when you come down around to the leg portion of the hide, and that would be this portion right in through here. Now, myself, I don't particularly use this leather. I cut it off and then I'll dry it, and since I do some fly tying from time to time, I'll actually save this in my fly tying box, and I'll use this hair for tying flies. So I don't get too carried away about saving every square inch of this hide for brain tanning, because I do use it for other purposes, and that's something that you might want to consider, because I do know from experience that when you get to this portion of the dehairing process, this is another tough spot on these hides, and since they are thin, they're very easy to cut through them. So I'll see you here again in a little bit. I'm going to get back to work. One of the other reasons why I like using this piece of PVC is because it allows me to get a pair of clamps and clamp that hide right into place as I go to scraping. Sometimes when you're working off of flesh beam or something that you prefer to use, your hide will slip and move on you. This way here, the clamp keeps the hide right where I need it to be so that I can work more efficiently. And also, it's important to keep the bottom of your knife, your scraping tool, clean, because you will get a buildup of hair that sticks to your scraping tool. And as you can see, I'm not working excessively hard scraping this hair and the epidermal layer off of this deer hide. With some experience, on an average size deer, you should be able to have it scraped down relatively easy in a couple of hours. There again, work slow, but work methodically. You don't have to bear down to the point of where you're cutting through the hide, but just scrape it. Scrape down through the epidermal layer. Okay, be back in just a few minutes. I get asked from time to time, how do you go about procuring hides? Well, if you're not a deer hunter or a big game hunter, sometimes that can present a problem. But if you look in your local area, go to a butcher, somebody that processes wild game, because that's a good source to get hides. And a lot of times, these meat processing plants will actually peel the hide off of their game, so you end up getting a hide that is really in good condition for, you know, your brain tanning. Sometimes what I've done in the past, when I know that there's a deer hunt going on and I'm unsuccessful in a draw, what I will do is I will go up during the season and talk to the hunters as they come back to camp. If you can locate the camps, talk to the hunters, ask them if they're successful, if they wouldn't mind, and if they're not planning on doing anything with the hide, they wouldn't just mind leaving it in a tree for you or something like that. I know here in New Mexico, the particular hunt that I hunt is only a 7-day hunt. So even if a deer hunter is successful in getting the deer opening day, and he manages to skin it that very day, 5 or 6 days later, that hide is not going to rot to the point to where you cannot use it. I myself have actually scavenged elk hides that have been on the ground for 2 weeks. Now, granted, the nighttime temperatures were cold enough that the fly infestation or the larvae growth was held to a minimum. Yes, the hides will stink. They might even be gross because some of these people that skin their hides will leave some of the, you know, the inner meat, sometimes the belly wall will be left behind. Once you get them home, soak them down, and then just scrape off the flesh, what would be the inside of the animal. Scrape that meat off. If you don't have time to process it right away, what you can do to preserve the hide, you can either ball it up and put it in a freezer, or what I do, just simply because I don't have a tremendous amount of freezer room, I will just lay it out and let the sun dry it, and then I will store it until till I have an opportunity to get to it. Now earlier, actually yesterday, I had dehaired 3 deer hides that I actually harvested 2 years ago off of a hunt that I was unsuccessful in, but the camp closest to me managed to harvest 3 deer. Now granted, when you do pick up hides off of a hunt like that, you don't know what you're going to get. And 2 of the hides that I did manage to salvage had some pretty big cut marks in them. To me, that's not a big deal because I make pouches and things like that, so I've learned to cut around the holes and, you know, make best use of the hide that I can when they're that damaged. This particular hide here was a deer that I actually harvested this year, as I mentioned earlier. I actually peeled the hide off of the animal, so I actually have a hide that only has 2 bullet holes in them, one entry wound and one exit wound. So if I can take my time and do a good enough job on this, I will avoid cutting holes in it as I'm scraping it. But there again, there are sources. If you know people that do hunt, you can just ask them if they would just mind giving you the hide, and more often than not, they will give you the hide. One other thing that I've tried doing is I've advertised locally in papers, sometimes like, you know, on a laundromat, I'll put a little flyer up that I buy deer hides and buy elk hides. Just so you'll have a little bit of a baseline, I am willing to pay $10 to $20 per hide. But before I actually purchase it, I let the potential seller know that if there are cut marks on the inside of the hide, I take $1 off for every cut mark, because every one of those cut marks will produce a hole in that hide by the time you're finished. Whether you're fleshing it, or whether you're dehairing it, or whether during the stretching and softening and drying process, those cut marks will produce a hole. So after a couple of times of buying hides off of these hunters, they quickly learned that if they want the full amount, they will peel the hide off of the game instead of using a knife to cut it off. So those are just some ideas, some options where you can locate workable, usable hides. I do want to mention this. Historically, the Native American Indians preferred to use bighorn sheep goat hides for their clothing material. Yeah, deer was abundant, elk was abundant, but the sheep, the bighorn sheep, is what they preferred to use. And if you live in an area such as like I do here in New Mexico, a lot of farmers raise sheep, not the bighorn sheep, but they do raise sheep. And you can actually get some really, really good hides and really good quality material, usable material, once you've gone through the tanning process. So those are just some thoughts. I'm going to get back to work before it dries out too much. One thing I'd like to point out at this point is that before you begin dehairing your hide, you'll want to make sure that you scrape all the membrane and all the fat chunks that may still be remaining on the flesh side of the hide. And the reason I suggest this, and the reason why I mention it, is you have a little chunk of fat right here. When you're dehairing it, if your knife hits that just right, it could cause you to skip, which could cause you to cut a hole in your hide that you're processing. So the point being is, the cleaner the flesh side of the hide is, the less likely your knife is going to skip, causing you to put a hole in your hide, which I have already managed to do in this particular hide. So I will show that a little bit later. It's not a huge hole. It's not something I can't live without. It's just something that I have to deal with when I get to the actual tanning process. Okay, as you can see, I'm getting to the finishing point of this hide. This is actually the neck portion of the deer. Now keep in mind that when you get to this portion, you're going to have to bear down a little bit harder in the scraping process, because the hide is actually thicker there, and it's a little harder to bulldoze or push the hair and the epidermal at the same time. So I'm just going to keep at it here until I get it dehaired. But you can actually hear the knife scraping, and there again you can see I tend to keep the bottom of the knife as clean as I can. Keep in mind too that when you're actually scraping, you're not scraping with the entire portion of the knife. You're only scraping with that little bit that's touching the rounded surface of this PVC, or in some cases the log, the fleshing beam. So slow and methodically. And you can see that the hair is slipping along with the epidermal layer. Make an adjustment here, get this on the top side. And as you do this, one thing you kind of want to keep in mind, that when you reposition your hide, you want to just take a moment and kind of lay it out flat if you can. Sometimes, if you're not careful, you might have a little fold underneath, and when you go to scrape that with the fold underneath, you might cause a skip, which will sometimes cause you to cut a hole in the hide. That's why it's very important that when you've fleshed the deer, you want to do as good a job as you can getting off the fat and most of the membrane. Now I myself I'm not too concerned with getting every bit of the membrane off, because in the actual tanning process, and as the hide is drying, that membrane can actually be peeled off, and or if you have a good coarse pumice stone, you can actually pumice stone it off. And when I get to that portion of the video, I will actually demonstrate that. But for now, we just want to concern ourselves with dehairing and getting all of the epidermal layer off. Okay, for me, that's well enough. And as you can see, this is one of the original bullet holes. And then somewhere because I didn't clean the belly side as good as I thought I did. I actually slipped and I cut another hole in the hide right here along the belly. And there again, I'm not too concerned with it. I get a little thin in those spots. But before I actually go and stretch, I may even elect to sew those holes up so they don't get any bigger as I'm stretching the hide. Now, one question that often gets overlooked when I'm teaching and instructing how to do brain tanning and dehairing is that even though the students watching, they're visually seeing what's taking place, they often forget to ask, well, how do you know if you've done a good enough job getting the epidermal layer off? Well, I will demonstrate that here in a minute, but the trick or the secret to it is when you get your hide dehaired, get a bucket of hot water. You don't want it so hot that it scalds your hand, because the theory behind it is if it's hot enough to burn you, it'll burn the hide. So if you get the water hot enough to where you can actually keep your hand in it, then it's hot enough to submerge the hide. Now what's going to happen is the hide will rehydrate and the epidermal layer will actually puff up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to excuse myself, go into the house, get a bucket of hot water, and I will demonstrate this. Okay, we've come to the portion where we're going to check and see how well we've done scraping the hide and getting that epidermal layer off. And this is actually a really important part of the process, because if you leave any of the epidermal layer on, your brain matter or the egg solution, which we're going to use in this particular video, will not get through, and you'll end up having a hide that dries with hard spots. So I've had this hide soaking in the bucket of hot water for about 10 minutes now, so let's pull it out and see how we've done on the scraping process. Okay, now one thing, you'll have to train your eye to determine what actually is the epidermal layer and what actually is a hill or valley that's created through the scraping process. As you learn this technique and become more familiar with it, you will understand and realize right away that no two scrapes have the same amount of pressure. So you're going to cut some spots of scrape, some spots a little deeper, some spots a little lighter. So with a little bit of experience, you can kind of see that the epidermal layer is puffed up and it's kind of shiny. I know the camera can't pick this up, but I will show what's left on my knife. The epidermal layer comes across as, in this particular hide, white and shiny. So you want to look the hide over. Now I myself, I just go ahead and just generally re-scrape the hide, not putting a tremendous amount of pressure. It serves two purposes. It ensures me that I'm getting the epidermal layer off, and it also thins the hide down a little bit in the more thicker spots. You can see right here, I'm hoping the camera can pick it up. It's kind of puffed up, it's kind of shiny. So I'll go ahead and start scraping there, and you can see that the epidermal layer is coming off. So I'm going to get back to work here, and we'll see you as soon as I'm finished. As I work on the hide here, when you're reading any books that have to do with brain tanning, there's going to be some terminology that you're not familiar with. When you hear somebody talk about, or reading in a book, they've bucked the hide, this is what they're referring to. Once you get the initial hair off, you get most of the epidermal layer off, they'll go back and they'll do what they call, they bucked it. B-U-C-K-E-D, bucked the hide. And that's basically what that terminology means, is you've gone back through and you've scraped it down a second time. And here again, the warm water helps you see where that epidermal layer still needs to come off the hide. Now when you're at this point of the process, you don't have to necessarily scrape very hard, but just scrape enough so that you're getting the rest of that epidermal layer off. And you can hear that I'm actually doing some scraping, keeping the bottom of my knife clean. And you can see how much of the hide or the flesh that I'm still scraping off. And here again, I don't worry too much about a perfectly scraped hide, because before I get ready to smoke it for a second time, I'll actually hit this with my pumice stone, and that'll help fluff it up, and that'll help put a smoother surface on the hide before you smoke the hide. I'm going to be a little bit lighter here. This is the belly section, and I know from my original dehairing that I got most of the epidermal layer off, because the epidermal layer on the belly part of your game is thin to begin with. Sometimes you can even peel that epidermal layer off, which is what I did in this particular case in this hide. And there's the hole I put in it, so I'm going to be a little cautious around it. One thing that you might want to keep in mind before you go to scraping is your ground surface. Now, I live out here in the southwest desert, so my ground condition is pretty rocky, pretty dirty, pretty sandy, and I don't bother putting a tarp down. But if you put a tarp down, then as you're dehairing your hide and as your hide drapes over your fleshing beam, you won't be picking up the debris off the ground. And trust me, rocks and dirt will stick to the belly side of this, and that's another area that you do need to be cautious of, because if you pick up a piece of rock, a piece of gravel on the flesh side and you go to scrape it, that again could cause you to chatter, which will, you know, eventually put a hole in your hide. I'm going to keep at it here, and we'll see you back in just a little bit. Okay, we've come to the portion to where this deer hide has been completely dehaired and the epidermal layer has been scraped off again through the bucking process. So you might be wondering, well, where do we go from here? Well, what I like to do myself is I like to completely dry the hide out. I'll put it on my stretching rack and let it dry for a couple of days, and you'll actually end up with what we call as a piece of raw hide. Now, what you decide to do with the raw hide, that's up to you. Some guys like to re-wet these, put them on some sort of form, maybe make a quiver for arrows. Some guys like to take the raw hide and make parfleche. Some guys like to take the raw hide, make drums out of it, even line knife sheaths with it. So what you decide to do with the raw hide is really up to your own imagination. So that's what I'm going to do with this hide that I finished dehairing, finished getting the epidermal layer off. I'm going to put it on my stretching rack and let it dry for a couple days. And the main purpose for doing this is that when you decide to put it in your brain solution or the egg solution, which will be done with this particular hide, is so that when it rehydrates, it picks up nothing but the tanning solution or the curing solution that you elect to use. So that's the reason why I choose to dry these completely. So we'll see you when we get ready for that part of the video. Thank you for watching. Hello everybody. Well, we've come to the portion of the tape here. We're going to talk about the actually breaking of the hide. We demonstrated earlier dehairing it, bucking it, getting through the epidermal layer. And just to clarify, even though I may use the terminology brain tanning, I want everybody to understand that I'm actually using eggs instead of the actual animal's brain. If you do elect to use the brain, guys, get a blender from a second-hand store. Do not use your wife's blender. One of the things when it comes to actually brain tanning and using the animal's brain, it's recommended that you cook the brain to kill any bacteria. Once the brain has been cooked, you'll want to put it in a blender and hit frappe and get it really liquefied. And then don't throw away the water that the brain was actually cooked in, because that water will contain some of the enzymes that you'll need to push all of your brain matter and those enzymes through the hide. So as I use the terminology brain tanning, keep in mind that I'm actually doing this and demonstrating that you'll get just as high a quality hide when you're finished by using eggs. One question that a lot of people ask me is, how many eggs do you use in this process? Well, like the animal's brain, too many eggs can never be too much. For this particular demonstration, I actually used 18 eggs, dozen and a half. And what I did is I filled up a 5-gallon bucket about halfway with hot water, cracked the eggs, put the eggs in there, and whip everything up. Now this particular hide that I've had in the bucket right now, it's been in there since yesterday morning, approximately 24 hours. And as I demonstrated earlier and showed earlier, I like to actually dry the hides completely in the raw hide. This is what we would refer to as raw hide. And the reason I like doing this is so that as it rehydrates, it soaks up all of the proteins or the albumin, which would be in the eggs. And when I do my drying process, I like to actually dry it over a pole and stretch it out so that when I get ready to put it in my 5-gallon bucket, it's already circular. If I had dried it flat, then you have to work the hide into something that'll fit into the bucket. And which I'm actually going to start soaking this particular hide today so that it'll be ready for me tomorrow. But what we're going to be discussing mainly today is the breaking portion of the hide. And really what you want to do at this point, as I have a rock holding the hide down, because sometimes as the hide rehydrates, there's air pockets that gets in the fold and the hide will actually float above your mixture. Now you can see specifically the raw hide, what the raw hide looks like. This hide has been soaking for 24 hours. And you can see that it's well rehydrated and it takes on kind of a creamy white color. And you can also see some spots where you may have missed some of the epidermal layer, because again, it'll swell up. But I'm not too concerned about that at this point, because I will demonstrate later what you can do with a really coarse pumice stone to get some of that off. But when we get to what I discuss about breaking, I don't know if the camera can quite pick it up, but you can see that as I pull the hide, it stretches and it takes on a different color. Well, what we really want to do at this point is wring out the excess water. Let me let the car go by. We'll wring out this excess water, or the brain solution or the egg solution. Get it back into the bucket. And as you can see, the hide pretty much looks like a wet noodle at this point. I'm going to put that down there for now. Whoops. I'm going to start soaking this hide. I'm going to work that in the bucket. Now don't worry about getting all of that hide submerged at once. What's going to happen as the bottom portion of the hide rehydrates, it'll become more flexible, and then you can actually shove more of the hide into the bucket. So now what we want to do is we want to get to the point to where I'm going to actually reposition the camera and get it, because I want to be able to show at this point what you really want to do is you want to wring out as much of the moisture out of your rehydrated hide. And something else that you might want to keep in mind, if you're looking to make just rawhide, you want to make products out of rawhide, then what you need to do is when you rehydrate it in water only. Okay, because if you try to rehydrate it in the egg solution or the brain tan, then what you're actually doing is you're actually curing the hide, and you'll never be able to get rawhide again. So if you're gonna scrape down the hide for the purpose of rawhide, when you get ready to work it, just rehydrate it with pure water. So let's pause for the cause. We'll get over to the to my stretching rack, and I'll show you what I do to get the excess tanning solution, the brain matter, out of the hide. Okay, here we are. We're going to work at wringing out some of the moisture that's in this hide. Just put it over a beam or something that you can actually start wringing the moisture out of this hide, because it'll help in the drying process when you put it in the sun. Now, I myself have somewhat of a tough time because I've got arthritis in my hands, so doing this is, for me, a difficult process, because I just don't have a lot of the hand strength I need to get the excess moisture out. What you can do in that case, if you can, and if the hide will allow, tie a little knot in it and then use a stick as leverage. Now, I did not tie a knot in this, but I'm just demonstrating how you can use a stick or something for the added leverage to get that hide. So get it balled up and then just pull on it. Now, this particular process serves two purposes. It helps get the excess water, braining solution out of the hide, but it also forces it through the pores of the hide also, which is very important because that is part of your curing, the curing process. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of water and braining solution coming through that hide, and you can usually tell if it's getting through the hide because certain portions of it will actually bubble up. So what I'll do is just open the hide back up, and I'll just reposition it so I can wring out some more of the solution. With the arthritis, I'll be paying for this tomorrow, I guarantee you. Because we haven't even gotten to the stretching part yet. But that's the idea. Just keep wringing it until you get about 90% of the moisture. We're expecting about a 70 to 75 degree day today here in New Mexico, which is really an ideal temperature for doing this, because as you're stretching the hide, you're not getting overly hot because of an 80 or 90 degree day. And also with the 70s temperature, the hide doesn't dry out too quick, which actually gives you more working time to soften it, because really what you want to accomplish is, as the hide is drying out, you want to be manipulating the hide so that it maintains a flexibility, maintains that cloth-like feel that leather has. So I'm going to shut the camera off. I'm going to keep working a little bit at getting some of the moisture out of here, and then basically what I'll do is I'll just pull the hide flat as much as I can, and then I'll lay it. Well, I like using my car hood because it's flat, and it just, the sun beats on the hood and it helps draw that moisture out. But here again, you can hang it on a pole just somewhere in the sun, because like hanging clothes on a clothesline, you want the sun to start drying, and you'll know when you've reached the proper point, because the hide will kind of get like a little bit of a green hue to it. You don't want to dry it too much, because then you'll have to rehydrate it. But that's another part of the process, that because I do have arthritis, I will actually get it to the point to where the hide is workable, flexible, not 100% dry, but dry enough so that I'll actually smoke it. And the smoking process actually makes breaking it the second time a whole lot easier, because now you've actually tanned the hide by using the tannins that are released through the wood smoke. But I'll explain that a little more in depth when I get to that point. So I'm going to get back to work here, get most of this wrung out, and we will see you when the hide is to the point of where we can actually start breaking it down. Okay, now we've come to the portion where we want to actually start stretching the hide and actually breaking the hide. Now there's still quite a bit of moisture left in this hide, but I just kind of want to demonstrate this. You can hopefully you can kind of see what I meant about the green hue. And actually the thinner portions of the hide have actually dried a little bit too much. If you can hear the crinkle, it sounds like paper. That's actually too dry, which is okay, because I plan on rehydrating or re-soaking this hide after I smoke it. But what I want to demonstrate here, and particularly in this point, what you want to be looking for when you go to break it is working it, and I actually use a semi-sharp post. This is actually just a 2x4, cut at an angle like this and kind of round it and soften it a little bit, because if it's too sharp, put too much pressure, you can actually poke a hole through the hide. But what you want to do is just keep working the hide, stretching it, and you'll see the hide change colors. It goes from that kind of a green hue to a lighter color, and in fact by the time we get done completely, it'll almost be white. So just kind of work the hide, stretch the hide. You don't have to put a ton of pressure on it, just enough to break open the pores. And you want to keep working this like this until the hide is dry. There's not any magic way to work it from center to out or from the edges to the center. Just kind of work the portions that are beginning to dry out, and typically it'll be the edges, particularly around the belly, because that's where the skin is the thinnest. Just kind of work that back and forth until you get it all broke. Now I've actually let this hide dry for about 30 minutes, and it's not scorching hot this day either, so it is taking a lot longer for it to dry out than you would normally expect. But you just work the hide, stretch it, and get all those fibers to start manipulating. Now a lot of guys that do this can break a hide in one stretching, but in order to do that you have to stay with it pretty much until it's completely done. And here we're coming to that really dry spot, so you can kind of hear the crinkling of the paper. But like I said, that's okay, because what I'll do is I will actually break the hide to the point where I'm actually going to smoke it, and then get the tannins that are absorbed into the hide back into the solution, and then I'll work that tannin through the hide as it's rehydrating, which I will demonstrate a little further on in the video. But for now, I'm just concerned with getting the pores opened up and start the fibers moving. And a lot of times you can just manipulate it by hand. I'm not using a tremendous amount of pressure. With the right amount of moisture, the hide will move. The fibers will work back and forth and stretch and pull. Kind of see where the drier portions are actually turning a white color. And I'm just stretching it and working it all back and forth. And contrary to some historical fantasies, women didn't chew the hide soft. They were actually working it, manipulating it, pretty much like I am right here. And with just the right amount of moisture, you can see that I'm actually getting quite a bit of stretch out of this hide. And one thing you'll notice as you're working the hide, especially when you get up around to the neck, the skin is very thick up in that portion, so it'll take a little bit of effort, a little bit of work to break that, to get it broke. But you will. A little bit of work, a little bit of patience. The hide will turn out very soft and very supple. You'll end up with a very nice piece of buckskin. So I'm going to keep working at this, and I'll see you as soon as I get ready to smoke the hide. Okay, well, I had to switch to Plan 13B. I broke my 2x4 that I had in the grounds because I hadn't really done any hides for the past 2 years, and I think the termites got the better half of that 2x4. But I had made a sawhorse that'll serve the same purpose. Kind of move it around here. I actually put a piece of maple, sharpened it, and I have it actually on the front of the sawhorse. When I do bigger hides, I actually like this because I can get up above it, put a little bit more down pressure, but more importantly, it keeps a lot of the hide off of the ground at the same time. But what I'm doing here is I'm just going to demonstrate that even with a sawhorse, you can still manage to stretch your hide as it's drying. You can work it off the end of the sawhorse like this. As you can see, I'm working that moisture right out of it as it's drying. Some guys like to do what they call cabling, and what the cabling actually is it's nothing more than putting a rope between two poles, pulling the rope tight, and then stretching the hide, pretty much similar to what I'm doing here, only over a cable, a rope that's above your head that allows you to use some downward pressure to manipulate the hide and the fibers as the hide is drying. And this one's actually drying pretty nice, but there again, I'm not too overly concerned at this point of getting it very dry and very soft, because I plan on smoking the hide and then re-immersing it back into the brain solution. And I'll just talk about that a little bit as I work the hide. The reason I do that is because the smoking, as I mentioned earlier, actually releases the tannins that are in the wood. Now, if you're not quite sure what the tannin is, if you've actually gone into the woods and picked up an acorn nut off of an acorn tree and bite into that very bitter taste, that's the tannin. Now granted, none of us, as a rule of thumb, don't burn acorn seeds to get the tannin, but just the bark, the wood, will release the tannins that are naturally in the wood as the wood is burning off. And it's that tannin that works its way into the pores of the hide during the smoking process. Now traditionally, a lot of your coloring of the hides was done also through the smoking process. The longer you leave the hide over your smoke, the more color you're going to get into your hide. Now, one question I get asked a lot is, what wood is better for smoking? Well, I like to do my initial smoking with oak, just simply because oak seems to have a lot more tannin in it than some of the other woods. But if you don't have oak available, any wood will do. I particularly don't like using any woods that have a lot of sap in them, like your pines, woods like that. But if you're going to color a hide, a lot of the guys that do brain tanning actually like cottonwood because it gets a really nice good color on the hide once you're finished. But one of the reasons why I like to smoke my hide at this point and then re-immerse it into the braining solution is because when you smoke it, your hide has the tannins on it, and then when you put it back in your brain solution, those tannins can be worked through the hide
a little bit easier, and in my opinion, you actually get a better looking end product. And one reason you have to smoke the hide is because at this point, if you get it soft and supple, like right in through here, this gets wet again, it'll dry with hard spots. The tannins, and which is actually the true tanning portion of brain tanning, will prevent the hide from drying hard if water is reintroduced into it. So the smoking process is a very important part of the step. So that's what I do, is I get it to this point, then I'll smoke it, and then I'll re-immerse it, and I'll actually work the hide a little bit in the brain solution to help push the tannin that is released back into your bucket of brain solution, or the eggs in this case, and that tannin will actually go through the fibers. Typically I only smoke it for maybe 2-3 hours, and then I'll go ahead and submerge it, maybe even overnight, let it get good and rehydrated again, and then I'll go back to work on it the following day. And because the tannins are already through the fibers and the pores of the skin, when it dries, it does not dry with hard spots, or at least that's been my experience with it. So even though there's still quite a bit of moisture left in this hide, right now I can actually start smoking this hide at any point. So I guess I'm gonna pause here and go build me a fire. Okay, I just want to show real simply, real quickly, how I choose to smoke my hides. It's not a real traditional way. All I have is a 55-gallon drum with a stovepipe that goes into the drum so that all my smoke empties into the drum. That way there, my hide stays away from the source of the fire. I actually have a collapsible wood stove on the other end of this stovepipe, so my fire's over there. My stovepipe is probably anywhere from 12 to 15 foot long, so that way there, my flame, or not the flame, but the smoke remains cold. The terminology when it comes to brain tanning, you'll hear sometimes a cold fire. Well, it's not really any such thing as a cold fire, but basically what a cold fire refers to is that there's a lot of smoke, a lot of smoldering. But the problem is, unless you're sitting with that source of fire, it could flare up, and if you're not careful and watching, you could end up burning your hide. So that's why I elect to do this. I keep my fire away from the hide, and I pipe the smoke to the barrel. So I'm going to go ahead and get the fire going, and we'll talk again in just a few minutes. Okay, as you can see, this is the source of my fire. You can also see that my hide is a long ways away from the heat source. Okay, as you can see, for me, this method of smoking a hide works very, very well. There's plenty of smoke coming out of the barrel, and I don't have to sit here and watch the fire and make sure that there's not any flare-ups. So for me, this works very well. And as I mentioned earlier, I will probably let this hide sit here and smoke here for, I don't know, maybe 2-3 hours, and then I'll go ahead and re-submerge it back into the braining solution so that all of the tannins that the hide is absorbing right now through the smoking process will be re-released into the brain mixture, and then I'll work that through the hide, so when I work the hide a second time, when it dries, it should dry soft and supple. Okay, so as the hide is smoking here, I want to talk a little bit about a terminology that you might run across if you decide to do any extra research into brain tanning. One of the terminologies that you'll hear is you want to smoke with real punky wood. And basically all that is just rotten wood. If you live in an area that has cottonwood trees, if you have some old growth cottonwood trees, or the cottonwood tree is dead, if you peel the bark, in the inner bark you can peel that away, and that is a really good source of smoke. In fact, I have some cottonwood inner bark over here. I'll just get that real quick and show you. Okay, here's what I was mentioning about the inner bark. Cottonwood tree, this inner bark here really produces a lot of smoke in your fire to release all of the tannins that you need to release to actually tan your hide. So if you live in an area that's real woodsy, you know as well as I do, you don't have to spend a lot of time in the woods to find some old rotten trees that would produce a lot of smoke. But if you do not live in an area where there's a lot of old growth, a lot of forest available, there is another source. I myself, also being a woodworker, save all of my wood shavings, especially what comes out of my jointing machine, my jointer. I save all of this, and when I get to the point where I actually want to smother the fire that is in my wood stove, I'll actually smother the fire with these wood shavings, and that'll produce a lot of smoke because these wood shavings actually mimic the punky wood that's desirable for creating a lot of smoke. But as you can see right now, I've got a good amount of smoke that's coming from my fire right now. So I think I'm going to go find me a good book to read. Okay, here we are again to this next portion of our brain tanning. Just to kind of let you know where we're at this point. Yesterday I was demonstrating stretching the hide, breaking the hide, and actually smoking it. I did manage to get both of my deer hides smoked. In fact, I was up after dark last night, still smoking, but I wanted to get it done. I did get them re-submerged in a fresh batch of curing material, braining solution, however you wish to refer to it is fine. And they've been soaking overnight. It doesn't really hurt the hide at all to re-submerge it in a fresh curing solution. At this point, because the hide has been smoked, you're not going to damage the hide. You're just not going to do it. If you leave it in there for a few weeks, and you let the bacteria continue to grow, you could cause some damage. But it's also worthy to re-note something. Yesterday ended up being kind of a cloudy day. We really didn't get a lot of good warm sun until like about 3:30, 4 o'clock, and I actually pulled the second hide out of my curing solution, wrung it out, and within 30 minutes, because I put it on my vehicle's hood and stretched and laid it all out flat, it was able to dry within 30 minutes. So I was able to get it broken and been able to get it to the burning barrel, the smoking barrel. But you should also bear in mind that if you, during this process, you come to the point where you're not going to get good weather for a few days, what you can do is just let the hide dry out, because if you interrupt this portion, you're not going to fail. It's just not going to happen. What you can do is that if you do know you're going to get a couple of days and you've allowed the hide to dry out once it's been cured or even smoked at this point, because I actually smoke my hide at this point, because when I put it back into the solution, I want the tannins that are released from the smoke to go back into my curing solution, and I'm actually going to work this solution through the hides now, because I want to make sure that those tannins get through the hide. But when you go to rehydrate the hide, you can either elect to use another egg solution, or another brain if that's what you choose to use, or you could just submerge it in water, because once you've cured the hide, it's not necessary to re-submerge it in another brain or another egg solution. I choose to do it because that just puts more albumin into the hide. If you are planning to rehydrate rawhide, again, just use water, because once your curing solution gets into the hide, you'll never get it back to the point of rawhide again. So let me just demonstrate. I'm going to change the angle of the camera here, so I'm going to demonstrate how you can visually see whether your braining solution in or the tannins are getting through the pores of the hide. So let me. Okay, I've repositioned everything in the sun for one very good reason. It's 42 degrees on this October morning, and there's a slight breeze, so it's a lot cooler in the shade than it is right here. Plus, I thought the camera would probably pick up better what I'm going to be describing next. Since I've had these hides soaking overnight, they're well rehydrated again, and the tannins were redeposited into my tanning solution, or my curing solution. You can actually smell the smoke coming up off of all of this. But to know whether you really got a lot of your curing solution or any of the tannins through the hides, what you can do is pick the hide out, bunch it up like this, and kind of squeeze. And if you can see all the bubbles working up through the hide, then you know that your curing solution and the tannins are actually being pushed, being forced through the pores of the hide. And you can see, hopefully the camera is able to pick it up. Didn't get no bubbles, but I can actually see the solution coming through the hide. There you go. Just got to get a big enough bunch. And also, another thing that you can be looking for while you're doing this is to see if yet there's any epidermis left on the top side of the hide, which would be the hair side. So I'm going to just sit here and work in this cold water while I, and you can also take and twist it, because that twisting forces the tannins from the smoking, and also your brine or your curing solution, whether that be eggs again or whether that actually be a brain, will actually push everything through the hide. Now I'm going to be doing something different. I've been brain tanning for nearly 20 years now, and one thing that I've never done as a brain tanner is I've never dyed a brain tan hide. And on the deer that I harvested this year, which one of these hides is from that deer, I'm actually going to dye it. I've got some walnut dye. Now it's not really a walnut dye that's factory produced. What I did is I went down to the health food store and I got some black walnut hull powder, and it's just basically a brown powder, and I'm going to be putting that in a container using salt as an emulsifier, and I'm going to actually be making my own dye. So for me, that's actually going to be a new experience. And as you can see, as I'm twisting it, you can see the curing solution, the brain matter or the eggs, is being forced through the pores of this hide. And one thing I do want to mention why smoking the hide is a very important step, very important process, is if you spend all your time softening up the hide and you get this really nice, soft, supple piece of leather, which is going to be white, by the way, and if you do not smoke it and that hide gets wet, even if it gets a drop of water, when that water dries, you will have a hard spot on that hide. So the smoking process is very important because of the tannins that are released through the smoking process. If that hide gets wet after you smoke it, it just takes very, very little effort to soften it back up. If you remember, during the first part of this video, I had an elk skin jacket on. And the very first time I wore that to a rendezvous, yeah, you guessed it, it rained. And it didn't get soaked through and through, but it got wet enough that you could tell that the jacket was wet. And I actually continued to wear that jacket until it dried. And I never even really had to pull at it or even re-stretch it, because it just dried soft and it dried supple, and just my moving around in it let it remain soft. And one way that you can maybe illustrate this, if you've ever taken a pair of denim jeans out of the dryer and you first put them on, you begin to think, man, have I put on any weight? Because your jeans will shrink just a little bit. But just through the normal wearing, the jean fibers relax, they kind of stretch back out, and they become a better fitting pair of clothing. Well, the brain tan hide will do the same thing. Once you smoke it, it gets wet. It just takes just a minimal amount of pressure to soften it back up. Whereas if it's in the white, just cure it and it gets wet, you'll have to re-stretch it and make it soft again. So the smoking process is a very important step, and if I mentioned it earlier, what the smoking does is that's actually the tanning process. Up until the smoking, it's just a curing process. And just to reiterate some things I mentioned the other day, I like using oak because naturally oak wood, the bark, the inner bark has a lot of natural tannins in it, and that's what is being released through the smoking process. Now, a lot of the guys that do brain tanning like to smoke their hides with cottonwood because they get a much darker color with the smoke that's produced through cottonwood. But I myself, living here in New Mexico, I've used juniper and gotten some very, very good results. Very pleased with the results. I like the color that was produced with the cedar or juniper. But there again, it doesn't matter. The longer you leave the hide smoking, you know, the more color it's going to take. Yeah, I'm getting really good movement through the hide here. I don't see any of the epidermal layer left on this hide at all. So I'm going to quit yakking at you, and I'm going to go to just working these two hides for a while. I might sit here for another 45 minutes just doing this because I want to make really sure that the tannins that have been redeposited into my solution really gets through the hide. And just to bear in mind another point, read what you can about brain tanning, because this is not the absolute way to do this. This works for me. Some guys will break the hide, soften it in one day, and smoke it the next day, and then just leave the hide with whatever color comes from their, smoking, whether they choose the barrel, whether they build a little teepee and wrap the hide around it and direct the smoke inside. However you choose to do it, just read what you can, educate yourself about this whole process, and then try to procure a couple of hides and just experiment. See what works best for you. Having the experience that I have over 20 years of doing this just works best for me. Okay, what I wanted to show here is that sometimes when it comes to wringing these out, more than likely your hide is going to have a bullet hole in it or a scraping hole in it. What you can do to help wring it out and get a lot of the moisture out, as you can see, I've installed a hook up here, and you can actually put the hook through the hole, and then you can go to wringing it out and getting that excess moisture out of the hide. But also it helps push your brain solution, or in this case also, since I've already pre-smoked the hide, get some of that tannin to push through. Now you want to be careful because your hole more than likely is going to be in a thinner part of the hide, and if it is, just be real careful with the amount of twisting and down pressure, especially since I'm on a chair. At this point, if that breaks, I could actually lose my balance and fall to the ground. Okay, I've got one of the hides dried and softened up. I've already smoked it once, but before I smoke it again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pumice stone and I'm going to felt it a little bit. It'll give me a chance to get some of the excess fibers off it, a chance to smoothen it up. If you do this before you smoke it, then your smoking might turn out a little bit evenly, and if you do it after you smoke it, then you'll end up taking some of the smoke coloring off it because you're actually removing the loose fibers. Now this is actually the belly side, which would actually, I meant to say the flesh side. This is actually the flesh side, and I don't know if the camera can quite pick it up, but you can see I'm actually removing a lot of the excess fibers, and basically some guys might even call it felting it. You do kind of want to be careful a little bit because I am using a very aggressive pumice stone, and you can get through the skin in an easy amount of time. I did want to point something out earlier. First part of the video I talked about skinning techniques, and I talked about some of the knife marks that these hunters will put on the hide, and then I mentioned they will tear through. Now I don't know if the camera can quite pick them up, but you can see all of these darker lines. These are caused from people using knives and actually cutting the flesh instead of the membrane. And as you can see right here, right in the middle of one, when I stretched it, it tore through. And I had mentioned that they will tear through. Got another big tear right here, and here again you can see the knife marks. They will tear through. So if you end up going to a butcher, meat processing plant, ask them to peel the hide as opposed to using a knife, because if they use a knife and they accidentally cut it, you will end up putting holes there. So I'm going to continue swading. I actually do have the other hide dyed. I set it out to dry, and kind of got busy doing something else and it dried a little hard and wrinkly, so I have it in my braining solution, once again rehydrating. I don't know if I'll actually have time to get to it this afternoon yet or not. I may have to just let it sit again overnight. It's getting a little late in the afternoon, and I don't know if I have enough time left to get it out of the solution and dry and stretched. So I may just have to save that one until tomorrow. Also, when you're swading it, this is a good time there again. I don't know if the camera can kind of pick it up. As you can see, there's a couple little light spots right in through here, right in through here. That's where the epidermal layer is still on the hide. Even though the hide is soft at this point, you can elect to leave it on, or you could elect to take your pumice stone and scratch it all away. For myself, doing what I do with these hides, it doesn't bother me to leave a little bit of that epidermal layer on there, just simply because for me, in the products that I make with these deer skins, is to me and my customers, it just adds character to it. For instance, if you get a buck that has some old battle scars, they will be left behind on the flesh once you dehair it, because it's actually a scar. A lot of my clients actually like it if I make them a pouch and put the battle scar in a prominent position on the pouch flap. There again, it just adds character. If you're deciding to make clothing out of this, you may elect to put it back into your tanning solution and break it down even some more. But the key factor is that when you're breaking the hide down, you really have to stay on it as it's drying, because when you're working the hide, you're actually still pushing the moisture out of the hide itself. So you really want to keep working with that hide until it's dry. You know, if you was to feel this hide itself, there's some parts on here that are actually very, very soft, very supple. There's a couple little spots that might be a little bit hard in some brain tanners' opinions, but for me, it's perfectly fine because I plan on making pouches and things like that with it. So for me at this point, other than smoking it one more time, I'm considering this particular hide finished. So I'll see you when I get on to the my dyed hide, and we'll see you then. Well, here we are at the conclusion, and I'm sure that everybody is anxiously awaiting to see the finished product. But what I'm going to show first is the hide that I picked up around a campsite 2 years ago. This was the smaller of the two hides that I had tanned. If you can kind of see the yellow golden color, I achieved that color by using juniper as the smoking wood. So from this piece of hide I can get many pouches of different sizes, different shapes. One thing that I do want to discuss here real briefly is that whether you elect to soften this, break the hide by hand, or use a stretching rack with, you know, a pole to do all of your, you know, your work for you, you're going to end up with the edges remaining a little hard. For myself, I don't worry about that, because even if you elect to stretch this in a hide, you will typically cut the hide out, leaving a portion of those edges behind. So in this instance, I just simply take a pair of scissors and I cut below the hard edges. Now I actually save these myself, because if I need a piece of tying string, I'll just re-soak that and get it soft. You're not working a whole hide, you're just working a small piece, and when it's soft enough and dry enough, then I just cut any lacing or string that I need from those harder edges. Okay, now we're going to come to the deer hide that I harvested this past season. This is the hide that I tried my little experiment on dyeing with walnut powder. It did not turn out like I had expected. It was very, very splotchy, so I actually took my pumice stone and I actually got all of the coloring out. This one here I actually smoked with a combination of cottonwood and juniper, and as you can see, I got a very actually I hope you can see I got a very different coloration through the hide. Now, something that I want to address, that when you go looking to buy brain tan, you'll need to ask some questions. Some people do their work on brain tan. I don't think that these people are purposely deceiving the buying public. It's just that it's something that they just don't think about saying. There's a very distinct look between commercial brain tan and something that's done in a very natural way, such as this. One of the easiest ways of telling whether it's commercial brain tan or brain tan done in the more traditional way is look how evenly colored the material is. When you do a smoking job like I do, you can tell that it's not very evenly colored. Will the commercial brain tan serve the same purpose as traditionally done brain tan? Absolutely. But for those of us that really want to stick true to tradition, those are some questions that you may want to ask. Now, I myself don't get too excited about a hide that's not evenly colored in the traditional way, just simply because over the years I have learned that the sun will fade your smoking job in time. So I don't worry about that. I'm going to show you a few pieces that I've had for a while, and just to show you that, you know, the coloring will come out. I've already showed the elk skin jacket that I've done. Now, when I originally smoked this, I had produced on it the darker colors, so you can kind of get an idea that, you know, wearing these items outside in the sun, they will fade. I made this bag. This is my fire starting kit that I've ornately beaded. But as you can see, they have actually faded. Here's a bag that I've been carrying for approximately 20 years now. Now, this particular bag is actually brain tanned. But as you can see, the sun has faded the smoky color. Another bag, again, showing that the sun does fade them. And my war shirt. I've actually had this for about 12 years now. And again, the sun has faded it. Another belt bag. I've had this one for about 15, 16 years also. This is actually brain tanned, not with eggs, but so that's why I don't get excited about looking at a piece of traditionally done brain tanned and not being awed by, oh, how perfectly the coloring is, or how splotchy it is, because I know with time these will fade. And here again, this is something when it comes to buying brain tan, don't be discouraged or put off because it's not evenly colored, because they will fade. So when it comes to sewing brain tan, making a shirt, if you have any questions, feel free to put your questions in the comment down below. But I mainly wanted to demonstrate through this video that you can obtain the same results whether you use the animal's brain or whether you elect to use eggs. You will end up with the same product. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time around.